My father stole my Nobel Prize. They called him a miracle with a pulse. On television, Dr. Alistair Thorne smiled like a man who had personally negotiated peace between disease and the human body. Under studio lights, his silver hair caught a tasteful gleam. The host would lean forward, reverent, and the audience would laugh at his dry jokes about grant committees and the stubbornness of cells. People loved him because he spoke in clean, confident sentences, because he made impossible things sound inevitable, as long as he was the one holding the pen. They did not see what happened after the cameras cut. They did not see the way his smile slid off as if it had been a garment he no longer needed. They did not see him step out of the applause and into the quiet with the same entitlement most people reserved for breathing. They did not see him flick his eyes over the room, not to take it in, but to confirm it belonged to him. To the public, he was celebrated. To his colleagues, he was legendary. To donors, he was a guarantee. He carried awards the way other men carried keys. Proof of access, proof of ownership. Nobel winning. World-renowned. The kind of name that made doors open before he even reached for the handle. To himself, he was something simpler. The smartest person in any room. And he didn't just believe it. He behaved like it. Like intelligence was not only a gift but a deed to everything nearby. Like the orbit of his brilliance gave him rights over whatever entered it. Ideas, credit, time, people. Especially people. I am Julian Thorne and I grew up inside that orbit. When I was little, I thought his confidence was love. If he corrected me, I assumed it was kindness. If he dismissed me, I assumed I had earned it. My father had a way of turning the air into a classroom without asking anyone if they wanted to enroll. He could take the simplest remark, an observation about the weather, a comment about a painting, and twist it into a lecture that ended with him being right and you being grateful. By the time I was old enough to recognize arrogance, it was already part of the furniture in our home. At dinners with visiting professors, he would introduce me like an accessory. "This is my daughter," he'd say, as if I were an interesting watch. "She's bright." A pause. A smile. "Not as bright as she thinks, of course." Everyone would chuckle politely because he was Dr. Thorne, because he could do no wrong, because the joke sounded affectionate if you weren't the one living inside it. The first time I realized he needed an audience the way other people needed air, I was 13. We were at a fundraiser, and he had just finished a speech about the sacred duty of science. A woman in a red dress told him she had lost her sister to a rare disease. My father held her hands, looked into her eyes and said, "We will end this suffering. Not someday. Soon." His voice did that softening thing, warm, reassuring, almost tender. When she walked away in tears of gratitude, he turned to me and said very quietly, "That's how you keep them giving. No warmth. No tenderness. Just a calculation spoken like an obvious truth." That was the line, the clean split between the persona and the private man. On stage, he was devotion. Off stage, he was appetite. In the lab, the split was even sharper. He ran his research empire like a kingdom. "My lab," he said. "My team. My work." He spoke of discoveries the way some men spoke of land, mapped, claimed, defended. People who worked under him learned quickly that there were two currencies: results and loyalty. If you produced both, you could stay close enough to feel the heat of his approval. If you produced only results, he would take them and look past you as if you were a tool that had done its job. If you produced neither, you disappeared. I tried to make myself indispensable. I tried to be brilliant in a way he couldn't deny. I did the long hours without complaint. I read the papers before anyone else. I ran simulations late into the night and fell asleep with my laptop open, face pressed to the edge of the keyboard, the screen still glowing like a small moon. I did it because I believed in the work. Because I believed that if I could give the world something true and useful, the world would meet me there. And because some part of me still wanted my father to look at me and see more than an extension of himself. He didn't. When I would offer an idea, he would listen with a neutral expression that made you think you were being heard. He was excellent at that, at performing attention. He would let me speak until I ran out of words, and then he would nod once and say, "No, or worse, not yet," as if my thinking was a fruit that needed more time to ripen under his supervision. Sometimes he didn't even bother with that. Sometimes he would glance at his phone while I spoke, the way a bored man glanced at a menu he had already decided against. I learned to keep my voice level. I learned to swallow disappointment in small, neat bites. I learned to translate his dismissal into fuel, because if I didn't, I would collapse under the weight of trying to earn love from a man who only recognized legacy. Legacy was his favorite word. He said it in interviews, in speeches, in private meetings with donors, but he said it differently in private, as if tasting it. Final legacy, he would murmur like a spell, like there was a finish line only he could see, and if he crossed it, the universe would owe him permanence. He talked about death with an odd impatience, not fear. Death was not a tragedy to him. It was an insult. A deadline. The one reviewer he could not charm, the one committee he could not bribe. His work was not just research. It was his argument against being forgotten. So everything became a brick in that monument. Every experiment, every paper, every student, every assistant. Every conversation was either a stepping stone or an obstacle, including conversations with me. The cruelest part wasn't the way he dismissed my advice. It was what happened afterward. A week after rejecting one of my proposals, an adjustment to a diagnostic pathway that would reduce false positives, he called a meeting with the senior team. I sat at the far end of the table, my notebook open, my hands steady. He walked in with that controlled swagger, the one that made everyone sit up straighter, and he began outlining a new approach. My approach. He didn't say my name. He didn't reference my work. He presented it as if it had arrived fully formed in his mind during some late-night communion with genius. He used my phrasing, even words I had chosen carefully, words I had practiced saying without trembling. The room was impressed. Heads nodded. A colleague murmured, "Brilliant, Alistair." My father accepted the praise like sunlight. I remember staring at the pen in my hand, the ink line I had just drawn through the margin of my notes. It looked like a small wound. I remember thinking with a calm that scared me that if I spoke up, if I said I suggested this, I designed this, I tested this, the room would go quiet, not in support of me but in discomfort, as if I had broken a rule. Because I had. In my father's world, everything in his orbit belonged to him. Ideas were not personal property, they were resources. If he could use them, he would. If he could take them, he did. And if the person who generated them happened to share his last name, it didn't make him softer. It made him feel more entitled. After the meeting, he passed me in the hall and said, without looking at me, "That was a good direction." As if he were complimenting a dog for retrieving a stick. As if the only acceptable form of acknowledgement was one that preserved his ownership. I wanted to hate him then. I wanted to turn the anger into something sharp and satisfying. But what I felt most was a quiet, aching clarity. He wasn't confused. He wasn't forgetful. He wasn't accidentally taking up too much space. He was building his final legacy, brick by brick, and he expected me to hand him the stones. The first time I realized I was standing on the edge of something career-defining, it wasn't fireworks. It was quieter than that. It was a stubborn anomaly that refused to behave the way the literature said it should. It started as a side thread, one of those questions that lives in the margins of a bigger project, the kind most labs ignore because it doesn't map neatly onto a grant deliverable. I only kept pulling it because it felt wrong in a particular way, and wrongness in research is often a doorway. The data came in like a whisper, a faint pattern that appeared only when I stopped forcing the variables into the expected frame. The usual diagnostic pathway treated the biomarkers like isolated signposts. But the body never reads like a checklist. It reads like a story, recursive, contextual, full of echoes. If you looked at the markers in sequence, you saw noise. If you looked at them as a network, a timing map of cascading signals, you saw something else entirely. A signature. It was subtle enough that anyone could miss it, and broad enough that if I was right it would change everything. Not a new drug. Not a new treatment. Something more foundational. A way to recognize disease before it announced itself. A method that would make the existing diagnostics look like staring at smoke and trying to guess where the fire might be. I did what I always did when I was afraid an idea might be real. I worked. I worked like a person trying to outrun doubt. I worked like the only way to keep the world from taking it from me was to make it undeniable. The lab emptied out at 6. By 7, the overhead lights buzzed with their own lonely electricity. At 9, the building belonged to the cleaning crew and the security guards and me. I learned the rhythm of the HVAC as if it were a second heartbeat. I ate vending machine dinners in the break room. the salt and sugar numbing my mouth while my mind stayed sharp. I wrapped myself in my father's lab coat because it was the only one that fit, the absurdity of it not lost on me. His name stitched across my chest while I did the work he would later claim. I brought in datasets that weren't supposed to be mixed. I negotiated access through colleagues who owed me favors, through back channels my father never bothered to learn because he assumed access was something the world granted him by default. I wrote scripts to clean the data, then rewrote them when I realized the cleaning process itself was erasing the signal. I built models that didn't just classify disease states but map transitions, how a healthy system bent into pathology step by step long before symptoms made a patient visible to the system. When the first proof of concept results came back, I didn't celebrate. I ran them again. And again. I attacked my own findings the way my father attacked other people's. Looking for weaknesses, flaws, opportunities for humiliation. If I could break it, it wasn't real. If I couldn't, it was. The most exhausting part wasn't the work. It was the fear of being wrong and the deeper fear of being right. Because being right meant it would be valuable. And in my father's world, value was an invitation. I started keeping a record that was more than routine. Notebooks, yes, meticulous timestamps signed, but also digital backups, encrypted drives, version histories of every draft, every code commit, every annotated dataset. I kept receipts because I had been raised by a man who treated credit like inheritance. I owned the insight. I owned the labor. I owned the proof. At least I told myself I did. When I finally brought it to him, I did it like someone approaching a wild animal, careful, respectful, trying not to trigger the reflex to bite. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had slept 2 hours the night before and the world felt slightly unreal, as if the edges of objects didn't quite line up. My father was in his office with the blinds half drawn, a wall of framed awards behind him. He looked up from his computer, expression politely impatient, the way a king acknowledges a servant. "What is it?" he asked. "I think I found a diagnostic pathway," I said, and I heard my voice shake on the word found. Not just a marker. A transition signature. It predicts onset earlier than anything we've got. He gestured for me to continue without moving his gaze from the screen. So I spoke anyway. I laid it out. The network model. The timing cascade. The validation runs. The false positive reduction. The implications. I expected questions. Criticism. A request for more proof. Some sign that he understood the scale of what I was offering. Instead, he leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing, not in curiosity but in evaluation. "And you're confident?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "But I want to expand the cohort. I need more diverse datasets." "I can." He lifted one finger, silencing me without effort. "Send me your draft. Your full draft. And your data." "My data." The words slipped out before I could stop them. He gave me a look that made my stomach tighten. "Our data," he corrected gently, as if teaching a child a basic fact of the universe. "You work in my lab." There it was. The ownership clause. The invisible contract I had signed by being born and then by being hungry enough to stay. I sent him the draft that night. I told myself it was normal. That of course the lab director would refine it. That of course he would take it through the proper channels. That I was being paranoid because that was easier than admitting I had cause. He returned it 2 days later covered in edits. Not scientific edits. Not changes to the methodology or the results. Language edits. He had stripped my voice from it. He replaced my careful phrases with his sharp, declarative ones. Where I had written, "Our findings suggest," he wrote, "I demonstrate." Where I had written, "We propose a model," he wrote, "I present a framework." He replaced "we" with "I" so casually it was almost beautiful in its audacity. At the top of the title page, in a font slightly larger than the rest, he had moved his name. His name first. Mine second. A small change, the kind that could be explained away. The kind that could be defended with bureaucracy. Seniority, leadership, lab convention. I stared at it for a long time, feeling something cold settle behind my ribs. "Alistair," I said when I went to him, because in professional settings he preferred his first name, preferred to seem approachable. "I think my name should be first author. I designed the model. I ran the analyses. He smiled as if I had said something charming. "Julianne," he said, Don't be naive. Authorship is politics. If we want this accepted quickly, if we want it taken seriously, it needs my name at the front. It's still my work, I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded. He stood, walked around the desk, and placed a hand on my shoulder. The gesture looked paternal. Felt like a weight. Listen, he murmured as if confiding wisdom. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than me even. A pause. But if it carries my name, it will reach the world faster. And isn't that what you want? For it to matter. He always knew how to twist virtue into submission. I nodded because I didn't know how not to. I nodded because the alternative was open war, and I was still pretending we were on the same side. That week, the administrative emails began, small, innocuous messages with attachments and forms. Authorship paperwork, the subject line read, as if it were a routine step. I filled out what I was asked to fill out. I signed what needed signing. I watched my name remain on the document and told myself that meant something. Then I stopped seeing the emails entirely. Submission channels, my father liked to say, were too important to be left to juniors. He controlled the accounts, the correspondence, the journal contacts, the internal approvals. He had built the entire pipeline so that nothing left the lab without passing through him. I didn't realize what that meant until I walked into the common area one morning and saw a printed journal proof on the table, fresh and crisp, with a sticky note attached in my father's handwriting. Big day, it read. Congratulations. At the top of the paper, bolded, centered, immaculate. Thorne. Only one author listed. I blinked once, twice, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something sane. The page didn't change. My name was gone. Not second. Not third. Gone. My hands went numb. My body understood betrayal before my mind could form the word. I found him in his office speaking on the phone with a donor. He was laughing, gracious, radiant. When he saw me in the doorway, he waved me off as if shooing a fly. I waited anyway, heart banging against my ribs like it wanted out. When he finally hung up, he looked at me with mild annoyance. What? He asked. I held up the proof. This, I said. You published it. Yes, he said, as if I had pointed out the weather. My name isn't on it. A pause, tiny, just long enough for him to decide what story he would tell. Then he frowned, the expression of a man confronted by someone else's irrationality. Julianne, he said, don't do this. Don't do what? My voice rose despite my effort to keep it level. I wrote that. I built it. He cut me off with a look so sharp it felt like a slap. You assisted, he said, each syllable deliberate. You contributed under my supervision. That is how labs work. That's not true. He leaned forward, voice dropping into something intimate and dangerous. Do you know what happens, he said softly, when a young researcher makes accusations that imply misconduct? Do you know what that does to their future? My mouth went dry. He straightened, smoothing his suit jacket, returning to the calm authority the world trusted. I am positioning this, he said, as my crowning achievement, my final legacy, the culmination of decades. I could barely breathe. And me, I whispered. He looked genuinely puzzled, as if the question didn't compute. You, he said, will benefit from being associated with me. Associated, not credited, not seen, not honored, attached like an accessory. He turned back to his computer, already done with me. Be smart, he added without looking up. Don't make this ugly. In that moment I understood the full shape of him. The public saint, the private thief, the father who could hold the world suffering tenderly in his hands for the cameras, then crush his own daughter's work without blinking. And I understood something else too, something colder, clearer, and far more dangerous. If he could take my discovery and erase my name as easily as a keystroke, he could take anything. Unless I made sure he couldn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my apartment floor with the journal proof spread out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. I kept reading the title, the abstract, the methods, my words wearing his name like a mask. Every time my eyes landed on Thorne, something in my chest tightened until it felt like I was breathing through cloth. By dawn, I had made a decision that felt both righteous and suicidal. I would object. Formally. Publicly if I had to. People like to tell stories about science as if it were pure. about truth prevailing because truth was elegant. But I had grown up close enough to see the machinery. I knew who controlled the narrative, who controlled the pipelines. Still, some part of me believed that if I brought proof, timestamps, code commits, notebook entries, dataset access logs, someone would look at my father and say, no, not this, not here. I walked into the institute like a person heading into a storm. My father's assistant looked up when I approached the front desk outside his office. She knew me. Of course she did. But the smile that used to greet me had been replaced by a flat, practiced neutrality. He's in a meeting, she said. I need to speak with him, I replied. She didn't move. You can email. I've emailed. Her fingers tightened around her pen. He's very busy, Julianne. I heard it then, the shift in my name. Not Julianne. Not Dr. Thorne's daughter. Just Julianne, like a subordinate. Like a problem. I turned away before my anger did something unhelpful. I went straight to the department chair's office instead. The chair was a man who had once called me a rare mind. He had offered to mentor me, had praised my work ethic, had told colleagues he expected I'd be leading a lab of my own someday. When I stepped into his doorway and asked for 5 minutes, his face tightened in a way that made my stomach drop. He already knew. Julianne, he said carefully, as if approaching a fragile object, I understand there's been a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, I said. I pulled out my binder, proof compiled like a legal case. I have documentation. I built the model. I ran the analyses. My father submitted under his name and removed mine. He didn't reach for the binder. His hand stayed folded on his desk, calm and useless. Alistair is a very, he paused, searching for a word that didn't sound like worship, influential figure. These situations can become complicated. It's not complicated, I insisted. My voice trembled despite my effort. It's theft. The chair exhaled slowly. Do you understand what you're accusing him of? Yes, I said. Do you? His eyes flicked toward the closed door as if the walls might be listening. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. This institute cannot be dragged into a public dispute between a senior scientist and a junior researcher. Especially not when the senior scientist is a Nobel laureate with donors calling daily. I'm not a junior researcher, I snapped. I'm a scientist. And the work is mine. That was the moment his expression changed, just slightly. Pity maybe. Or warning. I'm telling you, he said. For your own good, tread carefully. I left his office with my binder still untouched. The hallway seemed longer than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed like a taunt. People who normally greeted me turned their heads at the last second, suddenly fascinated by bulletin boards and coffee cups and their own shoes. I tried the ethics office next because there was supposed to be an ethics office. Because institutions like to advertise integrity the way companies advertise sustainability. The administrator at the desk listened to my explanation with a patient smile that never reached her eyes. Do you have a formal complaint? She asked. Yes, I said, and placed the binder in front of her. She glanced at it like it might be radioactive. And have you spoken with Dr. Thorne about your concerns? He's the one who did it, I said. Well, she replied, the smile tightening. We do encourage internal resolution when possible. I felt heat rise up my neck. Internal resolution, I repeated. You mean letting him tell me what he wants and calling it resolved? She didn't flinch. I'm saying these matters can be sensitive. Sensitive, I said, and heard how sharp the word sounded. Or inconvenient. Her eyes cooled. If you'd like to submit a complaint, you may. But I want you to understand that claims of this nature can have ramifications. For you, her tone implied. Not for him. I filed the complaint anyway. I walked back to my lab I still thought because some part of me hadn't caught up, only to find my keycard didn't work. I swiped it once. The red light blinked. I swiped it again, slower, as if carefulness could fix betrayal. Red. A postdoc came up behind me, awkwardly clearing his throat. Julianne. I turned and saw the discomfort in his eyes. He didn't want to be part of this. He wanted to get inside and pretend none of it was happening. My card isn't working, I said stupidly. He glanced down the hallway, then back at me. I heard there were changes. Access changes. Changes. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. What changes? He swallowed. Dr. Thorne said there was a security issue. A security issue. As if I were the threat. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me, the colleague who had once asked for my advice on his own work, with the fact that he was now treating me like a stranger at the door. You can go in, I said quietly. He hesitated, then pushed past me, swiping his own card. Green light. The door clicked open. He slipped inside without looking back. The door closed in my face. I went to HR next because there's always HR, the last stop on the tour of institutional cruelty. The woman who met with me was polite in the way people are polite when they've already made their decision. There's been a restructure, she said, eyes on her monitor. Your position is being eliminated. Eliminated, I repeated. Because I filed a complaint. Her lips pressed into a line. I can't speak to your interpretation. My funding, I began because I had grants connected to the work, proposals and review letters of support. Dr. Thorne is the principal investigator, she said. Those grants are under his oversight. My data, I said, and the word came out like a plea. My notebooks, my files. She finally looked up. Those are institute property, she replied, as if reading from scripture. You are not authorized to remove them. I felt my vision narrow. That's my research. It's research conducted under Dr. Thorne's lab, she corrected. And we've been advised that your role was supportive. Supportive. Like a handmaid to genius. Like a ghost holding up the chandelier. She slid a folder across the desk. Severance paperwork. A non-disclosure agreement. Terms that sounded reasonable until you recognized them as a muzzle. You can appeal, she added, tone mild. But I want to be honest, appeals are rarely successful. I didn't take the folder. My hands were shaking too much to risk dropping it. What did he tell you? I asked. The HR woman hesitated. Just enough. My stomach went cold. What did he say? Her voice softened, as if she were doing me a kindness. He said you were confused about your contributions. That you had become overly attached to certain aspects of the work. Attached. Like a delusional assistant who couldn't separate her role from his greatness. I left the building in a kind of numb trance. The air outside was bright, the sky indifferent, and people walked past me chatting about lunch plans as if the ground hadn't just opened beneath my feet. That afternoon the rumors began. At first, they were subtle emails that didn't get answered. Meetings that suddenly needed to be rescheduled. Then it became overt. A colleague I'd known for years called me, voice strained. Julianne, listen, I'm not saying I believe it, but Alistair is telling people you had some kind of breakdown. A breakdown, I repeated, tasting the word like poison. He said you were insisting the work was yours. He said you were fixated. Fixated, I said, and laughed once, a sharp sound that surprised us both. Right. Because wanting your name on your own work is fixation. Julianne, he pleaded, please. I'm trying to help you. If you push this, you'll burn everything. Everything was already burning. Within a week, the invitations vanished. A conference panel I'd been confirmed for suddenly went in a different direction. A journal editor who had once praised my clarity stopped replying. A grant reviewer who had asked for revisions withdrew the application entirely, citing concerns about leadership stability. Leadership stability. My father's language, repackaged in institutional jargon. Then the mentorships began to dissolve. People who had once championed me stopped calling. When I reached out, they offered vague sympathy and empty advice. Maybe take a break, one said, as if rest would restore stolen credit. Maybe find a new lab, another suggested, as if labs were available to women branded as unstable. The worst were the ones who acted like nothing had happened while quietly stepping away. The ones who smiled at me in a hallway, and then avoided being photographed in the same frame. The ones who said, you know how Alistair is, as if his cruelty were weather. I tried to fight. I did. I appealed. I forwarded evidence. I asked the ethics office for updates until the administrator stopped returning my calls. Finally, I received a single email, short, clean, final. After review, no action will be taken. No explanation. No acknowledgement of my binder. No mention of the work. My father's story had won. He began telling it on talk shows with that gentle laugh people loved. Julianne, he'd say when asked about his daughter's absence. Oh, she was an assistant in the lab for a time. Bright girl, but she got confused about the nature of collaborative work. It's unfortunate. The pressure can be intense for young minds. He said it with paternal sadness. The world ate it up. His daughter, the assistant who got confused. I watched the clips online late at night, the sound off, his mouth moving in smooth practice shapes. I could almost hear the undertone even without the audio. Poor Julianne. Not built for greatness. Not built for me. The blackballing was efficient because it didn't need a memo. It just needed a rumor and his name attached to it. People didn't want to take a risk on someone labeled difficult, unstable, delusional. Especially not when the person doing the labeling was a saint in a suit. Within months, there was no public trace of me in the academic world. No papers with my name. No conference appearances. No institutional page listing me as faculty or staff. My email account deactivated. My access revoked. It was as if I had never existed, except as a footnote in his origin myth. I tried applying elsewhere. Quietly. Carefully. But the moment my CV hit a desk, the silence followed. One lab director finally called me back. An older woman, blunt, kind in the way that didn't bother with false hope. Julianne, she said, you're talented. Your record is strong. But your father has made calls. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers ached. What did he say? She exhaled. He said you're brilliant but unstable. He said hiring you would invite trouble. Trouble. The word was a brand. A scarlet letter in a white coat world. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. My coffee went cold. The sun crossed the sky. My life narrowed to one fact. He had not just taken my work. He had taken my future in that world. Academia was a city with locked gates, and he had ordered them closed. For a while I grieved like someone grieving a death because it was one, not of a person but of a self. The version of me who believed hard work would be enough. The version of me who believed institutions protected truth. Some days I couldn't get out of bed. Other days I moved through routines without feeling present. As if my body were a machine and my mind had gone somewhere else to hide. I stopped reading journals because the language made me nauseous. I stopped opening emails because they were either pity or silence. I went to the grocery store and saw a magazine cover at the checkout. My father, smiling beneath the headline about his crowning achievement. I stood there frozen until the cashier asked if I was okay. I wanted to scream. Instead I paid for my groceries and walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car until my hands stopped shaking. Then slowly the grief began to change shape. It didn't disappear. It hardened. It became focus. I started taking stock of what he hadn't taken. He hadn't taken the way my mind worked. He hadn't taken the instinct that had seen the anomaly and refused to let it go. He hadn't taken my ability to build something from nothing, because that ability was mine long before I stepped into his lab. I began to think about terrain. Academia had rules he had mastered. It had committees and gatekeepers and prestige ladders. It was a cathedral built for men like him, where his name was already carved into the stone. If I stayed on that terrain, I would lose forever. He would always be the loudest voice, the most trusted narrative, the hand on every lever. So I stopped trying to win there. The first decision was small. I took down my framed diplomas from the wall. I put away the conference badges I'd saved like relics. I removed the parts of my identity that were tied to a world that had exiled me. The second decision was bigger. I stopped asking for permission. I began attending private tech meetups in borrowed clothes, blending into rooms where no one cared who my father was. I listened. I learned the language of product instead of publication, of deployment instead of peer review. I met engineers who didn't worship titles. I met investors who didn't care about academic politics as long as you could prove your technology worked. I built a new kind of binder, one filled with plans instead of grievances. At night, when the anger threatened to swallow me, I opened my laptop and worked. Not to reclaim my past. To build my future. I disappeared from academia the way a person slips beneath water. Not drowning but choosing depth. No papers. No conferences. No public trace. Let them think I had collapsed. Let them tell stories about my fragility, my confusion, my break. It was better that way. gave me silence, gave me space, gave me time. Because if my father wanted a final legacy, I would give him one. Just not the one he expected. I would win on different terrain, on ground he didn't control, in a world where his Nobel didn't open doors, where his phone calls didn't close them. And when I came back, it wouldn't be as his daughter. It would be as his reckoning. In the private sector, nobody cared that I had once been praised in faculty meetings. Nobody cared that a Nobel laureate had erased my name from a paper. Nobody cared about my grief or my rage, or the quiet bruises academia had left on my confidence. They cared about one thing. Can you make it work? It was almost a relief. I started in a rented room above a dentist's office, the kind of space that came with thin walls, and the constant hum of someone else's life happening on the other side. My lab was a folding table, a second-hand workstation, and a whiteboard with so many arrows and boxes it looked like a conspiracy map. I built the first version of the model the way you build a lifeboat, fast, with whatever you can find, without the luxury of elegance. I did not call it what it was. Not yet. In early pitch decks I used careful words: predictive diagnostics, networked biomarker sequencing, pre-symptomatic detection. I avoided the phrase transition signature because that belonged to my father's myth now, and I refused to let him have even the vocabulary of my future. The first hurdle was money. Science in academia was expensive and slow, but it came with scaffolding. Grants, shared equipment, institutional access. In the private world, you paid for everything: compute time, validation cohorts, legal counsel, lab space, regulatory consultants. Every dollar was a question. Do you deserve to exist? I pitched to investors who smiled too much and listened too little. One of them, a man with a watch that cost more than my monthly rent, leaned back in his chair and said, "So you're telling me you can predict disease before symptoms show up?" "Yes," I replied. He laughed softly, as if I'd offered him a magic trick. "That's ambitious. And you're doing this alone." "I'm doing it correctly," I said. He tilted his head. "And what's your moat?" "My mind," I thought. But I didn't say that. I said, "The data architecture. The model. The patents." He waved a hand. "Patents are expensive. And frankly, diagnostics is crowded. You'll get crushed." I smiled back, calm as glass. "Then it's good I'm not building a diagnostic test," I said. "I'm building a diagnostic operating system." That phrase changed the room. It was simple enough for them to understand and dangerous enough to make them curious. They asked for proof. They always asked for proof. So I gave it to them in pieces: small demonstrations, controlled pilots, results that could be verified without giving away the core. I learned to show enough that people leaned forward, but not so much that they could replicate it. I learned to talk like someone who would not be dismissed. The second hurdle was skepticism from the industry itself. Clinicians are trained to distrust anything that smells like hype. Hospital administrators are trained to distrust anything that threatens their budgets. Regulatory consultants are trained to distrust anything they didn't think of first. Every meeting had the same rhythm. A polite introduction. A few minutes of impressed silence. And then the resistance. "It's a black box," they'd say. "It will increase liability," they'd say. "It will overwhelm clinicians with false positives," they'd say. "Patients won't consent to that level of data analysis," they'd say. "Your model can't generalize across populations," they'd say. And then, inevitably, someone would say the word that made my jaw tighten every time: academia. As if my disappearance from that world meant my work was suspect. As if the gatekeepers who had shut me out were also the only people qualified to judge my mind. I didn't argue. I outbuilt them. I designed the system so it could explain itself, because the mistake everyone made with AI was thinking accuracy was enough. Medicine required trust. So I built interpretability layers. Not just predictions but rationale. Not just alerts but context. A physician could drill down and see the cascade, the timing map, the network shifts that led to the risk score. It wasn't because the model said so. It was because the body is whispering this story, and here are the lines. I built guardrails, thresholds that adjusted based on clinical workflows, patient history, local standards of care. I built integration so it didn't require hospitals to reinvent their entire infrastructure, because nobody adopts a revolution if it breaks their day-to-day. And when someone said false positives, I pulled up the comparative studies and showed them how the model reduced unnecessary interventions by catching the wrong kind of early signal noise masquerading as danger and filtering it out. I gave them what academia never gave me: unassailable proof. The third hurdle arrived like a knife sliding under a door. A letter from a law firm. It was heavy with intimidation, full of phrases designed to make a person panic. Intellectual property, prior art, confidentiality, injunctive relief. The sender was my father's counsel. The message was clear even through the legal fog. You're building something that looks like his work. No, he was saying something worse. You're building something that is his work. He was reaching across the years to claim ownership of my mind. I read the letter twice, then laughed, not because it was funny but because it was exactly who he was. He had stolen my discovery and now wanted to steal my future too. By turning the world's ignorance into his weapon. He underestimated one thing. I had learned from him. I did not respond emotionally. I responded strategically. I hired a patent attorney with a reputation for turning courtroom battles into chess games. I showed her my documentation, timestamp versions, independent development logs, new architectures, improvements that went far beyond the published paper. I had rebuilt the core from the ground up, incorporating entirely new modalities, new data streams, new methods of validation. And I had done the one thing my father never expected from me. I had prepared. We filed patents not on the obvious outputs but on the infrastructure itself, the data ingestion pipelines, the network mapping, the temporal cascade detection, the interpretability layers, the integration protocols. We patented the how and the why, not just the what. We created a fortress out of technical specificity. Then we did something more ruthless. We filed in jurisdictions my father rarely considered. Global pathways that ensured even if he tried to challenge me in one country, he'd be fighting Hydra heads everywhere. When his lawyers threatened again, we responded with a single, clean letter. We welcomed discovery. Because discovery was the one thing he couldn't survive. He lived on narrative. In court, narrative collapses under evidence. He never sued. Instead, he tried something else: pressure through reputation. Quiet calls to contacts. Whisper campaigns. Subtle sabotage. But the private sector is not academia. It does not worship sainthood. It worships outcomes. And my outcomes were undeniable. Pilot programs turned into contracts. Contracts turned into partnerships. Partnerships turned into scale. The first time a major hospital network adopted my system, I sat alone in my office. Now a real office, glass walls, actual furniture. And stared at the signed agreement until my eyes blurred. Not because of the money. The numbers were astonishing, yes. But money was just a language. What mattered was what the contract represented. Access. Integration. A place inside the machinery. I expanded quickly but not recklessly. I knew what it meant to build something powerful. Power attracts predators. I had been raised by one. So I built the company the way you build a defensive city. Layers, redundancies, control points. We acquired a small lab chain not because we needed prestige, but because we needed physical nodes for validation and deployment. Then another. Then another. We standardized them, upgraded equipment, created protocols so the system could be tested and tuned continuously with real-world samples. We built relationships with diagnostics manufacturers, quietly at first, then openly. I negotiated supply chain agreements that ensured our recommended tests could be delivered with speed and consistency. Not just the analysis but the follow-through. Not just prediction but action. We didn't sell software like a product. We embedded it like a dependency. And the investors who had once smiled politely at me now spoke my name with something close to reverence. In meetings, they didn't ask if I was ambitious. They asked how quickly we could expand. I watched my net worth climb the way you watch the tide rise. Inevitable, steady, powerful. I became on paper a billionaire. Then I became something rarer. A multi-billionaire whose wealth wasn't tied to a fragile stock hype cycle, but to contracts, patents, licensing, and infrastructure. But even that wasn't the real point. Wealth was a consequence. Control was the design. By the time the headlines started finding me, mysterious founder, reclusive innovator, private sector disruptor, I had already moved past the stage where anyone could stop me with a rumor. Because I wasn't just making an AI tool. I was building the infrastructure of modern medicine. The patents were the first layer. Hospitals couldn't replicate the system without licensing. Competitors couldn't copy the integration protocols without stepping into legal quicksand. Even companies with more money than sense couldn't simply build their own version, because the pathways were locked behind my intellectual property. The licensing agreements were the second layer. I structured them like arteries, flowing in ways that made my system essential. Some licenses were exclusive by region, others by modality, others by patient cohort. The more a partner used the system, the deeper it became woven into their operations. The switching costs weren't just financial, they were functional. If they left, they would lose the continuity of their own data. Data pipelines were the third layer. I didn't just collect data. I owned the pipelines that moved its secure, compliant, integrated channels that hospitals depended on to feed the model and receive output. I built relationships with EHR vendors and inserted my system at the seams where data already traveled. Not as an external add-on, but as a layer in the workflow. Labs were the fourth layer. Our lab network became a validation backbone. We weren't waiting on outside entities to test our models. We were continuously refining them with controlled rigor. We offered hospitals bundled services. Analytics plus testing plus logistics. When you offer a complete loop, you don't become a vendor, you become a utility. Supply chains were the fifth layer. When our system flagged risk, we ensured the appropriate follow-up tests and monitoring resources were available. In medicine, prediction without access is cruelty. I refused to build cruelty, so I secured supply contracts, distribution channels, and prioritized manufacturing runs. If a hospital adopted our system, they adopted our ecosystem. And then came the final layer. Contracts. Not flashy partnerships announced on stage, but long, quiet agreements with hospital systems, insurers, diagnostic manufacturers, research consortiums. The kind of contracts that don't make headlines but make worlds run. Hospitals began to rely on my infrastructure because it saved them money, reduced bad outcomes, improved early detection, and gave clinicians something they rarely had: time. Time bought through foresight. At some point, the system became so embedded that it was no longer an option. It was the option. And then the private satisfaction arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, but sharp and perfect. I imagine my father reading about my company in some industry briefing, realizing too late what I had built. Not a paper he could steal. Not a lab he could lock me out of. Not a committee he could charm. A machine. A network. An entire terrain he didn't control. He had always believed legacy was something you carved into marble and forced the world to admire. I had learned something else. Legacy is leverage. And I had leverage in places he couldn't reach. The world still saw him as the celebrated genius, the Nobel scientist, the man whose name floated above medicine like a blessing. Let them. Behind the scenes, behind the awards and interviews in glossy magazines, the real machinery of modern healthcare was beginning to run on pathways I owned. Not because I wanted to be admired, because I wanted to be untouchable. And because there was one man, one arrogant, obsessed man who needed to learn the difference between being famous and being powerless. At first, my father's victory looked complete. His paper, my paper, became the cornerstone of a new narrative. He toured it like a relic, presenting the breakthrough at symposiums and private donor dinners. He spoke about the future with that practiced blend of humility and certainty, the way a priest speaks about salvation. He was photographed beside presidents of institutes and CEOs of pharmaceutical giants, his hands folded, his expression thoughtful, as if the weight of human suffering rested comfortably in his palms. And for a while the world believed. The trouble began in the place applause can't reach: replication. In the months after publication, other labs tried to build on his work. Some were competitors, hungry for the next leap. Some were collaborators, eager to validate and extend what he'd claimed. And some were simply good scientists doing what science demands, testing claims against reality. They hit the same wall over and over. The theory didn't scale. In controlled, narrow cohorts it behaved beautifully, just as it had in my initial findings. But outside those carefully constrained conditions, the signal softened, then fractured. In diverse populations the transition signature wasn't absent exactly, but it wasn't reliable in the neat, publishable way my father promised. It didn't replicate cleanly. It didn't generalize without the architecture I had built later, the guardrails, the interpretability layers, the cross-modality checks. Without those, the breakthrough became something far more dangerous than a failure. It became inconsistent. In medicine, inconsistency isn't disappointment. It's risk, liability, headlines that don't flatter, grants that don't renew. At first, my father did what he always did. He spoke louder. When labs reported trouble, he dismissed them with polished condescension. "You must understand the subtleties," he said in interviews. "Reproduction requires expertise." He implied the failure belonged to them, their incompetence, their sloppy methods, their lack of vision. But the failures kept coming. A team in Europe couldn't replicate the effect across their cohort. A major U.S. lab published a cautious commentary, respectful but unmistakable, questioning the robustness of his claims. A pharmaceutical partner quietly paused discussions, citing unresolved validation concerns. His critics didn't accuse him of fraud. Not directly. They didn't need to. They used the only blade science respects: data. My father's lab, once a beacon, began to feel like a stage set. The lighting still worked. The props were still impressive. But behind the scenes, the beams that held it up were weakening. And weakness terrified him, because his final legacy wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a promise he'd sold to the world. He had built fundraising campaigns around it. He had promised donors their names would be engraved on the future. He had promised the institute prestige and profit. He had promised his colleagues a place in history. And above all, he had promised himself immortality. So he did what any man does when the story starts cracking. He asked for more money. The first signs were subtle. Renewed fundraising efforts, private meetings with donors, glossy prospectuses describing the next phase. He positioned it as inevitable growth. Of course the work required investment. Of course there were costs to greatness. But as replication troubles spread, his requests grew sharper, more urgent. He needed a massive capital infusion. Not for discovery. Discovery is patient, sometimes slow. He needed it to keep the facade alive. More technicians. More equipment. More cohorts. More data acquisition. More high-profile partnerships that could be announced as proof the world still believed. More PR. More advisory boards stacked with prestigious names. He wasn't funding science. He was funding confidence. And confidence is expensive. Watching it from the outside felt like observing a fire spread through dry wood. Slow until it suddenly wasn't. I saw the grant announcements. The institute press releases. The carefully worded updates that said everything and nothing. I watched my father's face on panels, still smooth, still radiant, but with a new tightness around the eyes. A man who feared being exposed always watches the room a little too closely. He needed money and he needed it fast. That was when my name entered his life again. Not publicly. Not directly. Quietly. Invisibly. Like a phantom placing a hand on his shoulder. The first foundation came into existence on paper in a nondescript office building with a mailbox that hosted dozens of other entities. Its mission statement was impeccable. Advancing early diagnostic science for underserved communities. Its board members were respectable. Its donations were clean, traceable, generous. It made a multi-million-dollar gift to my father's institute. The institute celebrated. My father accepted the check in a small ceremony, smiling as cameras flashed. He praised the anonymous benefactors. His voice warm with gratitude. If he suspected anything, he gave no sign. Then came the second foundation and the third. Each with a slightly different mission. Each with different trustees. Each with perfectly arranged paperwork that made them appear independent, legitimate, altruistic. Their contributions flowed in predictable waves. Enough to stabilize his lab. Enough to make him feel secure. Enough to reassure donors that the work was thriving. The outside world saw it as miraculous. Dr. Thorne's research attracting unprecedented philanthropic support. My father saw it as confirmation. The universe still wanted him. He didn't realize he was being fed on a leash. I didn't give him money in one dramatic lump, because a lump invites scrutiny and questions. Instead, I built a river. Slow, steady, seemingly endless. A river that made him dependent without realizing he was drinking from my hand. 4 years, the funding continued. Enough to keep his team staffed, his equipment updated, his trials running. Enough to keep him from collapsing. Enough to make him believe he was still in control. And then gently I began to steer. It started with suggestions, quietly introduced through the foundation's scientific advisory interests. A foundation would request quarterly updates focused on a particular avenue. Another would sponsor a symposium on a niche approach. Another would fund a special initiative tied to a specific method, a specific cohort, a specific technology stack. To anyone else, it looked like normal philanthropy. Donors often have preferences. Foundations often push projects toward their mission goals. But my preferences were not moral. They were structural. I guided my father toward an expensive path that looked like a gold road. It was shiny, promising, packed with buzzwords and prestige. It attracted attention and justified budgets. It made him feel like he was still pioneering something grand. It was also by design a cul-de-sac. The path required specialized instrumentation with long lead times and exclusive vendor contracts. It required hiring star researchers with high salaries and egos. It required building a new wing of the lab to house the next-generation platform. It required massive ongoing operating costs, maintenance, upgrades, proprietary reagents. It was the kind of path that, once you committed, you couldn't easily abandon without admitting failure. And my father committed with enthusiasm, because it was exactly the kind of undertaking that fit his mythology. Huge, ambitious, expensive, visible. Something you could point to on a tour. Something you could name after yourself. He began describing this new direction as the inevitable evolution of his breakthrough. He said the early replication issues weren't failures, they were growing pains. He assured everyone the new platform would solve them. He promised a magnum opus that would silence critics. He started recruiting, expanding, building, announcing. The foundations, my foundations, praised his vision and funded every step. He never noticed that each check came with a gentle nudge toward deeper investment, toward more sunk costs, toward a point of no return. I watched him pour money into equipment that dazzled but didn't fix the core problem. I watched him chase a scaling solution that produced elegant graphs in narrow conditions, but collapsed under real-world variation. I watched him build a tower on sand, convinced the height proved its strength. The most important part wasn't the science. It was the psychology. My father could not pivot easily because pivoting requires humility. Pivoting requires admitting you were wrong. Pivoting requires seeing the work as truth-seeking rather than ego-serving. So when the path demanded more money, he asked for it. And I gave it. When it demanded more time, he took it. When it demanded more faith, he demanded it from everyone around him. He didn't see the cul-de-sac because he was too busy admiring the road. Years passed like this. My father kept afloat by generosity he didn't understand. His lab bustling, his institute proud, his donors reassured by the appearance of momentum. He became known not just for the breakthrough, but for the sheer scale of his next phase. It was impressive. It was expensive. It was unsustainable. And it was exactly where I wanted him. Because a cul-de-sac isn't a dead end at first. It's a place that feels safe. Until you realize the only way out is to turn around in full view of everyone watching. My father would never turn around. He would keep driving forward, confident the road would open. And all the while, he would be building the most delicate structure of all. A life that depended on my continued generosity. A legacy balanced on money I could stop whenever I chose. The invitation arrived in my inbox as if the universe enjoyed irony. The Thorne Institute presents the magnum opus, a global unveiling of the next era of medicine. Black tie gala, live-streamed keynote, press embargo, donor reception. A stage built not for science but for worship. My father's name was everywhere. Gold-foiled on heavy cardstock, embossed on banners, threaded through the entire language of the event like a prayer. The promotional copy was breathless. A culmination. A revolution. A legacy secured. The Institute had rented a downtown hall with a ceiling like a cathedral. They had commissioned a documentary crew. They had arranged for a celebrity moderator. Someone whose job was to translate complex ideas into awe. They weren't unveiling results. They were unveiling him. In the weeks leading up to it, he saturated the airwaves. Morning shows. Medical panels. Prestigious podcasts where hosts practically whispered his name. He spoke about the future of predictive medicine, with a solemn smile. as if he were a benevolent king promising prosperity. Behind the smile I could see the hunger. The closer the date came, the more he glowed with a feverish certainty. He was convinced this was the moment the universe had been arranging for decades, the moment his critics would be silenced, his name fixed permanently in the architecture of medicine. His final legacy. All the stakes were stacked in the open. Every donor he'd ever cultivated was invited. Every reporter who had ever praised him had a seat reserved. Every colleague who had ever doubted him was about to watch him win in front of the world. It was maximum visibility by design because my father didn't just want to be right. He wanted witnesses. The institute transformed into a hive. In photos released to the press, the new wing of his research center shimmered with polished glass and stainless steel. It looked like the future. Sleek corridors, bright labs, machines that cost more than most homes. They showed him standing in the center, coat crisp, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some imagined horizon. He loved those shots. I could tell. He'd built this moment like a man building a mausoleum he intended to live inside forever. The night before the gala, he hosted a private donor dinner. 8 figures in pledges on the table. 2 senators. 3 executives. A handful of foundation representatives, people whose faces never appeared in photos, but whose money shaped what science got to become. They toasted him. They praised him. They thanked him for giving humanity hope. My father accepted it all with practiced grace. And somewhere inside that grace, I knew, he was already carving the epitaph. Dr. Alistair Thorne, the man who ended uncertainty. He walked onto the stage the next evening to a standing ovation. The hall was packed. Cameras hovered like insects. The live stream counter ticked upward in the corner of the screen. Tens of thousands watching, waiting. Journalists leaned forward with notebooks open. Donors smiled with the satisfied expression of people who believed they had bought a piece of history. Behind my father, a massive screen displayed a looping montage. Children laughing, doctors in scrubs, researchers pipetting, my father's face in soft focus, his hands cradling a test tube as if it were holy. He took the microphone and waited until the applause softened into reverent silence. "My friends," he began, voice warm, intimate. "Tonight is not just a celebration of science. Tonight is a promise. To every patient who has ever waited too long. To every family who has ever heard the words, 'If only we'd caught it sooner.'" The audience nodded, enthralled. He had them exactly where he wanted them. Emotional, grateful, ready to believe. He continued, drawing them through the story he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. How his early work had opened the door. How his lab had endured setbacks. How the next phase had demanded unprecedented resources. How they had built something that would change everything. He spoke of truth. He spoke of integrity. He spoke of the sacred duty of medicine. The hypocrisy was so clean it almost sparkled. Then he lifted his chin, as if feeling the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. "And now," he said, letting the pause stretch, "I am honored to share with you what I believe will be remembered as the defining achievement of my life's work." The screen behind him shifted to a title slide. "The Thorne Platform. Predictive Diagnostics at Global Scale." The room erupted. He smiled modestly, the way great men smiled when the world recognized their greatness. He began describing the platform, how it would integrate across hospital systems, how it would transform early detection, how it would become the new standard of care. He spoke as if the future were already signed and sealed. Then on cue, the moderator returned to the stage. "And this is where we get to the practical question," she said brightly, the way hosts do when steering awe toward action. "Doctor, how soon can hospitals adopt this? How soon can patients benefit?" My father beamed. "Immediately," he said. "We have built the infrastructure. The partnerships are in place. We are ready." And then, smooth as silk, she added the line that had been scripted into the program, the line meant to pull the final lever of credibility. "And we're honored to have representatives from the philanthropic foundations that made this possible," she said. "These visionary partners funded the most ambitious scientific expansion in the Institute's history." A camera panned across a row of foundation delegates. Polite applause. My father turned slightly, palms open toward them, magnanimous. "Without their generosity," he said, "this would not exist." He didn't know he was pointing at the hand that held his throat, The moderator smiled. In fact, she said, we have a brief recorded message from one of the key benefactors to mark this historic evening. A technician signaled from the wing. My father looked pleased, surprised perhaps, but pleased. He loved surprises when they were praise. The screen behind him went dark. Then it lit up. Not with a donor message. With a simple Stark slide. White background, black text. Notice of ownership and termination. A ripple moved through the room. Confusion first, like wind across water. My father's smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second. The moderator blinked, still smiling, but her eyes darted off stage. The technician's hands hovered over controls like a man trying to stop a car from rolling downhill. Then the slide changed. A list appeared, itemized with brutal clarity. All patents and provisional filings associated with the Thorn platform. All exclusive licenses for the platform's core diagnostic architecture. All proprietary integration protocols and interpretability layers. All lab equipment purchased under initiative funding tranches A through H. The building located at 1147 Hartwell Avenue, Research Wing expansion. All data pipeline infrastructure and secure transfer systems supporting the platform. At the bottom, one line. Owned by Hartwell Biomedical Trust and affiliated entities. My father stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him personally. The room went silent in a way that didn't feel reverent anymore. It felt dangerous. Then the final slide appeared. A short statement, clear and calm. No drama, no flourish. Just a verdict. Effective immediately. All funding is withdrawn due to intellectual dishonesty and misrepresentation of authorship. All licenses are revoked. All leased equipment is subject to immediate repossession. All building occupancy agreements are terminated. Further use of the platform constitutes infringement. A beat. Then, at the very bottom, a final line appeared, smaller font, the kind you had to lean forward to read. Signed, Julian Thorn. For a moment, the room didn't move. It was as if everyone needed time to understand what they had just witnessed. Not a scandal whispered in hallways, not a rumor in an email chain, but a public decapitation. My father didn't breathe. His face had drained of color so fast it looked unreal. His eyes flicked left, right, searching the crowd the way a man searches for an exit in a fire. The moderator's smile finally died. Doctor? She whispered into the microphone, forgetting she was amplified. A few people in the front row began murmuring. Reporters lifted their phones. Donors turned to each other, expressions shifting from admiration to alarm. My father stepped toward the screen, as if proximity could change it, as if he could physically intimidate text into disappearing. He leaned toward the technician off stage, hissing something. The technician shook his head, frantic. Someone else rushed in, whispering into an earpiece, face pale. Then the first notification hit the back channels, the kind of operational messages institutes never see until something has already snapped. A senior lab manager's phone buzzed. He glanced down and his eyes widened. Then another phone buzzed. Then another. Like a chain reaction. Across the hall, a donor, a man who had pledged 8 figures, stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. He looked at my father with a fury that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with humiliation. You told us this was secure, he said loudly. A reporter shouted from the aisle. Dr. Thorn, did you misrepresent authorship? Another voice. Is the platform still viable? The moderator tried to regain control. Everyone, please. But the room had shifted. The spell was broken. My father reached for the microphone again, his hand shaking just enough to be visible on the giant screen. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again, forcing a laugh that sounded like glass cracking. This is clearly a misunderstanding, he said, voice too high. A family matter. An unfortunate family, someone snapped. We invested in you. The livestream chat was exploding. You could feel it even without seeing it, the digital swarm, the immediate dissection, the instant loss of narrative control. My father had always owned the story. Now the story owned him. Off stage, a staffer rushed to him with a phone pressed to her chest like a confession. He glanced at the screen and froze. Whatever he read there made his shoulders tighten, his jaw clench. Repossession notices, termination letters, injunction filings. The machinery was already moving. Because I hadn't just withdrawn money. I had pulled the bolts. Somewhere in that shining new research wing, lights were still on. Machines still hummed. People still pipetted and calibrated, unaware the ground beneath them had just been legally erased. But the contracts that allowed them to be there were gone. The equipment they were using no longer belonged to the institute. The building they worked in was no longer theirs to occupy. The patents my father needed to claim legitimacy, the ones that made donors feel safe, were mine. And the funding that kept his entire facade inflated had been cut so cleanly it was surgical. He turned, scanning the crowd, desperate for a friendly face. Someone who would still believe him, still save him. What he found instead were 100 expressions shifting into calculation. People were already deciding how far to stand from him, how quickly to leave, how to avoid being photographed in the wreckage. The institute's director appeared at the edge of the stage, face strained, gesturing urgently for my father to come off. The moderator stepped back, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with the realization that she had just hosted a public collapse. My father stood in the center of the stage, his cathedral, his altar, his moment of immortality, while the empire he'd built on stolen work dissolved in real time. The applause from minutes ago felt like a hallucination. Now there was only the sound of chairs moving, of voices rising, of reporters pushing forward, of donors demanding answers. And my father, Dr. Alastair Thorne, celebrated, arrogant, obsessed with final legacy, looked suddenly like what he had always been beneath the awards and the charm. A man terrified of being seen without his mask. He tried to speak again, to reclaim the narrative one last time. But the words wouldn't arrange themselves into power anymore. Because at the moment of maximum visibility, I had done the one thing he never imagined possible. I had made the world see the truth. Not in a complaint filed quietly. Not in a committee meeting. But in front of everyone he needed most. His press. His donors. His reputation. His legacy. And then I watched, calm, unseen, unstoppable, as his monument began to crumble piece by piece, exactly as I had designed it to. I didn't reveal myself to the world by walking onto a stage. I revealed myself the way I had learned to survive, through systems, through leverage, through proof. 2 days after the gala imploded, the medical press was still feasting on the spectacle. Headlines focused on the scandal. The funding pulled, the ownership shock, the public humiliation. They wrote about my father's collapse as if it were a morality play. They speculated about family betrayal, about legal warfare, about egos too large to fit inside one legacy. They were looking at the fire. They weren't looking at what I had built in the dark. On the third day, while commentators were still debating whether Dr. Alastair Thorne had lost control of his institute, a different announcement landed, quietly at first, then everywhere. A peer-reviewed publication, released simultaneously across multiple top-tier journals through a coordinated embargo. A full technical white paper hosted on an open platform with complete validation datasets and methodology notes. A public statement issued by my company, signed in my name. Not a scandal. A solution. The announcement was simple. A clinically deployable, explainable, globally scalable diagnostic framework with validated outcomes across diverse populations. Ready now. No myth. No drama. No messianic promises. Just the thing medicine respects most, results. The press expected revenge. They expected me to use my father's collapse as a victory lap, to twist the knife, to make the story about betrayal and blood. Instead, I made it about patience. I framed it the way it should have been framed from the beginning, not as a crowning achievement for any single man, but as a mechanism to reduce suffering. The statement was clinical, restrained, almost cold. I didn't mention my father by name. I didn't have to, because the solution itself did what no public accusation could ever accomplish. It proved his stolen theories were not just ethically tainted. They were wrong. The difference was visible in the data like a bright line. Where his platform relied on brittle assumptions, linear relationships, narrow cohorts, fragile generalization, mine demonstrated robust performance in real-world conditions, across ages, across races, across comorbidities, across the messy variability of actual human lives. Where his approach broke when the inputs changed, mine adapted because it had been built to understand the body as a system, not a set of isolated markers. Where his results collapsed under replication, mine improved under scale, because the architecture had been designed for scaling from the beginning. And most importantly, where his work offered prediction without clarity, a black box dressed in prestige, mine offered explanation that clinicians could trust. It was as if the medical world had been watching someone hammer together a beautiful stage set, and suddenly the real building appeared behind it, steel and glass and load-bearing beams. Reporters who had once called my father visionary now used different words in their follow-ups. Obsolete, flawed, superseded. They were careful at first. Institutions always are. Nobody likes to admit they were fooled. But medicine has its own kind of cruelty. When the facts arrive, sentiment dies quickly. Within hours, panels that had once praised my father were discussing my framework as the true leap forward. Within a day, hospital systems began issuing statements confirming they were evaluating immediate integration. Within a week, major insurers, who move only when the numbers force them, announced pilot reimbursements tied to the new standard. The world didn't just turn away from my father. It replaced him. And replacement is the sharpest form of irrelevance. That was the point. Not humiliation. Invalidation. Because if I simply exposed his theft, he could still cling to the claim that the science was his even if the credit wasn't. He could still posture as the genius wronged by family drama. He could still argue that politics, not truth, had brought him down. But when the actual solution arrived, clean, validated, working, his entire myth collapsed with it. He wasn't the man who had almost solved it. He was the man who hadn't. His final legacy wasn't a masterpiece. It was a dead end, and everyone could see it. The aftermath was not cinematic. It was administrative, bureaucratic, and merciless the way real consequences usually are. Boards began to resign. Not all at once, but in a steady stream that looked like panic wearing a suit. Members of the Institute's governing board issued terse statements about fiduciary concerns and ethical standards. Advisory council members withdrew their names from the website. Corporate partners quietly removed their logos from press releases, pretending they had never been there. The donors were worse. You can survive public shame when you still have money. You cannot survive public shame when wealthy people feel they've been made foolish. Pledges evaporated. Endowments were frozen pending investigation. A major philanthropic group demanded full audits, then demanded their money back, then demanded blood. The Institute's leadership scrambled to save itself by cutting ties with the one man who had become too expensive to defend. My father went from centerpiece to contagion in a matter of days. Socially radioactive. That phrase doesn't sound real until you watch it happen. Colleagues stopped answering his calls. Invitations to speak vanished overnight. Conferences quietly removed his name from programs. A medical association that had planned to honor him for lifetime achievement postponed the award, then canceled it with a statement about ongoing review. Even his friends, if he had ever had real friends, began to disappear. The world has a way of pretending it never admired you once admiration becomes inconvenient. And institutions are experts at self-preservation. They questioned his honors next. At first it was whispered. Should we revisit his major awards? Should we re-examine his landmark papers? Then it became formal. Committees convened. Review panels were formed. Journal editors were contacted. The Institute announced an independent investigation, with just enough independence to sound credible. My father tried to fight it with the only weapon he had ever trusted: authority. He issued statements about misunderstandings, private disputes, malicious actors. He threatened lawsuits. He demanded retractions of articles that mentioned authorship concerns. But he no longer had a lab. He no longer had funding. He no longer had infrastructure. And worst of all, he no longer had the one thing that made people tolerate his arrogance. He no longer had the best science. Without that, he was just a man with a history of charm and a fresh stain that wouldn't wash out. The final blow was painfully ordinary. A banking notice. His accounts, personal and institutional, were tied up in litigation. The Institute's legal team, now more frightened of donors than loyal to him, distanced itself. Vendors demanded payment. Employees filed claims. The building he had toured like a monument was no longer his to enter without permission. He began selling things. Not publicly at first. Quietly. A watch here. Piece of art there. A car he rarely drove. A townhouse in a neighborhood chosen for prestige rather than comfort. His life shrank. And the smaller it became, the more visible the truth was. He had never built legacy. He had built dependence, on applause, on money, on other people's labor, on borrowed credit. Once those were gone, there was nothing underneath but a hollow space where his certainty used to be. He tried to find new ground. He approached a smaller institute, offering consulting. They declined. He reached out to an old colleague to propose a collaboration. Silence. He sent feelers to a private foundation. They replied with a polite refusal that didn't bother to hide the reason. We are not in a position to associate with your work at this time. At this time, they said, because even cruelty likes to pretend it leaves doors open. But the doors stayed shut. His name became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and labs. Proof that prestige could rot. Proof that institutions could be fooled. Proof that one scandal could expose a decade of unchecked entitlement. And then, inevitably, people began to ask the question that always comes when a monument falls. Who was holding it up? That's when my name, once erased, returned in full. Not as his daughter. Not as an assistant. As the architect of what actually worked. The medical world moved on with the speed of a system that doesn't mourn the obsolete. My framework became the new standard. Hospitals integrated. Regulators approved. Patients benefited. And my father. He remained. Alive, yes, but stripped of the only immortality he had ever chased. He had wanted history carved with his name. Instead, history recorded him as the man who tried to steal the future. And ended up erased by it. The first report came to me through a channel I hadn't used in years. Not an email. Not a call. Not anything that could be traced back to me with a simple subpoena. A message passed through an intermediary who had learned painfully that privacy in my world was not optional. He's sick. That was all it said at first. No name. No drama. I didn't need one. There are some truths you can feel before you confirm them. I sat in my office, glass walls, quiet hum of servers behind a secured door. The steady, contained power of a system that ran without anyone's applause, and stared at the message until the words lost their meaning. Outside, the city moved like it always did. Cars. People. Lives continuing. Somewhere, a siren faded into the distance. My father was sick. The irony was almost too neat, too perfect, as if the universe had hired a cruel editor. He had built his entire public identity around conquering a particular condition, the kind of disease that arrived quietly, progressed invisibly, and then announced itself when it was already too late. He had promised he would stop it at the doorstep. He had sold donors a future where families never heard the fatal phrase, "If only we'd caught it sooner." Now he was living inside that phrase. I didn't know the details at first. I didn't ask. Asking was a kind of permission, and I had learned not to give my father permission to enter my mind. But details have a way of finding you when your name sits inside the infrastructure of medicine. A week later, my legal counsel handed me a sealed envelope from a medical liaison. "This came through an external request channel," she said carefully. "It's personal." I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The paper itself felt like him, formal, entitled, heavy with expectation. Still, I broke the seal. The letter was typed, not handwritten. Of course, my father didn't write by hand unless he wanted the gesture to feel intimate, and he never did intimacy without strategy. Julian. No greeting. No apology. No acknowledgement of what he had done to me. Just my name placed at the top like a key he expected would turn. He described his condition in technical language, as if speaking clinically would keep him from sounding afraid. He referenced markers, progression stages, treatment options. He cited studies, some of them mine, which made my stomach tighten. Then he moved into what he wanted, the way a man moves into a room he believes he owns. He wanted access. He wanted my platform. He wanted priority placement in a clinical program that didn't officially exist for ordinary people. He wanted my team. My resources. My network. He wanted what I had built the way he had always wanted things, as if wanting was enough to justify taking. And threaded through the whole letter was a note of disbelief, as if the illness itself were an offense. He couldn't say it outright, but I could hear it between the lines. This isn't supposed to happen to me. At the end, he tried for warmth. You understand better than anyone what's at stake. You know what this condition does. You know the possibilities. I am asking you. No, I am relying on you to do what is right. Relying on you. As if he had ever relied on me when relying meant trust instead of extraction. I set the letter down and looked out through the glass at the city again. My reflection hovered faintly in the window, older than the girl who used to carry binders through institute hallways, steadier than the woman who once cried alone in her car. I watched my own face for a moment, as if searching for what I was supposed to feel. Pity didn't come. Joy didn't come either, which surprised me. I had imagined, in the abstract, that his suffering might feel like balance, like justice arriving with a scalpel, but it didn't feel like justice. Felt like gravity. Of course he would get sick. Of course his body, like every body, would eventually betray its own illusion of permanence. Of course the man who believed he was exempt from limitation would be dragged, kicking, into the same human condition he had made his career performing against. What struck me wasn't his illness. It was the way he reached for me. The assumption beneath the request was so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. The belief that the world, and everyone in it, existed to serve his needs. Even now. Even after everything. Even after I had dismantled him in front of his gods. He still wrote as if I belonged to him. As if my resources were his inheritance. As if my brilliance, my infrastructure, my entire empire of patents and pipelines and contracts was simply an extension of his orbit. And when he needed it, he could call it back like a tool left on the wrong bench. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pretend to understand the harm he'd done. The closest he came to acknowledging our history was a single sentence, slipped in like a concession. We both know there were misunderstandings in the past. Misunderstandings. As if he had accidentally pressed delete on my name. As if he had accidentally called me unstable to colleagues. As if he had accidentally closed every door in my professional world. And now, faced with the slow, indifferent cruelty of disease, he reached out expecting the same dynamic to hold. He takes. I provide. He was wrong about many things. He was wrong about the world. He was wrong about legacy. He was wrong about the durability of stolen credit. But he had always been wrong most of all about me. A few days after the letter he called. Not through official channels. Not through counsel. Directly. I recognized the number immediately. It was the same number that used to light up my phone when he wanted me to fix something in his life without being thanked for it. Seeing it now was like seeing an old scar reopen, not with pain but with memory. I let it ring. It rang again the next morning. Then again. By the fourth call my assistant flagged it, concerned. It's persistent, she said carefully, as if the word were diplomatic. Persistent was one word for it. Entitled was another. On the fifth call I answered. I didn't speak first. I listened to the faint sound of breathing, the way you can hear someone trying to steady themselves before performing. Then his voice came through, older, thinner, but still carrying the same expectation wrapped in calm authority. Julianne, he said, as if my name were a lever he could still pull. Finally. Finally. No hello. No question. Just relief that the universe had returned to its proper order. Why are you calling me? I asked. My voice was flat, controlled. Not cold. Precision is different from cold. A pause. Then with an audible effort toward gentleness. We need to talk. We, I repeated. Yes, he said, as if it were obvious. This is serious. The condition is progressing. I've reviewed the latest protocols and it's clear your system, He stopped as if the word your tasted wrong. It's clear the platform is the best chance. There it was. Not I'm afraid. Not I need help. Procurement decision. A man shopping for survival. You want access, I said. I want what's necessary, he replied. You know the timing matters. I know, I said, and felt the weight of that truth settle. Timing always mattered. Timing had been everything in my work. Timing had been everything in my life with him, too. He exhaled, then leaned into the assumption that had always carried him through conflict. Julianne, he said, voice sharpening slightly, I am your father. As if biology were a contract. As if fatherhood were a crown. As if the years of theft and retaliation could be overwritten by a title he'd only ever used when it benefited him. He continued, tone shifting into something almost indignant. Whatever happened between us, whatever you think happened, this is beyond that now. This is real. This is life. I gripped the phone harder, my knuckles whitening. You don't get to rewrite it, I said quietly. I'm not rewriting anything, he snapped and then caught himself, smoothing his voice again. I'm asking you to be reasonable. Reasonable. The same word institutions had used when they told me to tread carefully. The same word that meant, accept what powerful people do. I could picture him as he spoke, sitting upright, jaw tight, eyes fixed on some distant point where he still believed he was in control. I could picture the fear beneath it, the fear he didn't know how to name without turning it into anger. And in that fear, the final assumption of entitlement shone like a core. He believed I would save him because he believed saving him was my role. Not as a doctor, not as a scientist, not even as a human being. As his daughter, an asset he had once owned, discarded, and now wanted to reclaim because it was useful again. He had spent his life taking credit for cures. Now he wanted the cure itself. And he wanted it from me. The room was exactly what government funding buys when it's stretched thin. Clean, functional, and tired. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the steady impatience of machinery that never sleeps. The walls were painted a color meant to feel soothing but landed somewhere between fog and resignation. A plastic chair sat in the corner beside a metal tray table. The window was half blocked by a building that looked just like this one. Another stack of rooms where hope and paperwork shared the same air. My father lay in the bed like a man who had been reduced to essentials. No tailored suit. No awards on the wall. No donors waiting outside. The hospital gown hung loosely from his shoulders, the thin fabric doing nothing to preserve dignity. His hair was still silver, but it had lost its stage-ready shine. His face was paler than I remembered. His hands, once so expressive on podiums, rested limp on the blanket, for lines taped to the skin like small, unavoidable truths. There was a television mounted high in the corner. The volume was off. A news ticker crawled silently along the bottom of the screen. Something about markets. Something about weather. The world moving forward without caring who was in this bed. When I stepped into the doorway, he turned his head quickly, as if he'd been listening for footsteps. Julianne, he said. He tried to sound relieved. The word came out strained. I didn't answer right away. I took in the room as if I were inspecting a set because in a way it was a set. Not for his performance. For mine. For the final act of a story he had started years ago when he decided I was something he could use. I walked in, closed the door behind me with a soft click, and crossed the room without hurry. No dramatic entrance. No sharp heels striking tile like a threat. I wore a simple coat. No jewelry. No badge that would announce who I was. In this place, names didn't carry power. Charts did. My father watched me the way he always had, measuring, calculating, searching for the angle that would return control to his hands. You came, he said like it was an accomplishment. I said I would, I replied. His eyes flicked over my face, hunting for emotion. He wanted anger because anger could be manipulated. He wanted tears because tears could be dismissed. He wanted anything that would give him a foothold. I gave him nothing. I pulled the plastic chair closer to the bed and sat down. The chair squeaked under my weight, loud in the quiet. I set a slim folder on my lap, not like a weapon, not like evidence, just like something I had brought because it needed to be delivered. He swallowed. So, he said, attempting lightness, this is where we are. This is where you are, I corrected gently. A flicker passed through his eyes, irritation, then effortful restraint. Julianne, he began, I don't have time for. For what? I asked. Accuracy. His jaw tightened. He turned his head slightly toward the window, as if the world outside might intervene on his behalf. Then he looked back at me. I'm ill, he said, and the admission sounded like an accusation. You know what this is. You know what your system can do. Yes, I said. His gaze sharpened, hopeful. Then, I lifted one hand, not in hostility but in pause, the way a physician stops a patient from spiraling. He froze, offended by the gesture but unable to override it. I'm not here to argue, I said, and I'm not here to relitigate the past. He exhaled, and for a moment he looked almost satisfied. as if this was proof that his narrative still held. See, she's here. She'll do the right thing. She'll do what I want and call it nobility. I let him have that illusion for one more breath. Then I opened the folder. Inside was a single printed document, official letterhead, clean typography, the kind of formatting institutions use when they want to look unassailable. I slid it across the blanket toward him. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. His eyes moved over the words. The veins in his neck tightened as he read. The name at the top wasn't Thorne Institute. It wasn't any institution that had ever been his. It was mine. The Julian Vale Scholarship for Ethical Diagnostics. A fund supporting early career researchers committed to transparent methods, reproducible science, and patient-centered outcomes. Julian Vale. The reclaimed identity. The name I had chosen after I disappeared. After I rebuilt myself in a world that didn't require my father's approval. A name that belonged to me alone. Untangled from his orbit, unclaimable by his legacy. I watched him reach the section labeled eligibility requirements. His mouth tightened as his eyes moved line by line. Then he stopped. He read the sentence again, slower. His face changed, confusion first, then dawning comprehension, then a kind of stunned anger. "What is this?" he demanded, voice rough. "It's a scholarship," I said. "Fully endowed. Permanent. For students who will build medicine forward, without stealing the future from anyone else." His eyes snapped back to the eligibility clause as if trying to deny what it said. Because it was explicit. It was written in the clean, unemotional language of institutions, simple enough that no one could pretend it was a misunderstanding. Applicants must not share the Thorne surname, nor be direct descendants of Dr. Alastair Thorne. It didn't say in spirit. It didn't say unless exceptions apply. It didn't dress itself in softness. It banned his name from the future I was funding. His hands shook harder now. "You can't," he rasped. "I can," I said. He stared at the page like it was a verdict handed down by a judge he had never bribed. "This is vindictive," he said, though the words sounded weak, like he was trying on a moral argument that didn't fit him anymore. "It's preventative," I replied. "It's structural. It's what you taught me." His eyes flashed. "I taught you?" I leaned forward slightly, not threatening, just present. "You taught me that names are weapons," I said. "That systems protect power. That institutions don't care about truth unless truth has leverage." He looked away, breathing through his nose like a man trying not to explode. "So you've come to gloat," he muttered. "No," I said. "I've come to close the loop." He turned back, anger sharpening his face into something more familiar. "I don't understand what game you're playing," he snapped. "It isn't a game," I said. "It's a correction." The monitor beside his bed beeped softly. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past. A nurse laughed quietly at something another nurse said. The sound brief and human and indifferent. My father looked suddenly smaller in that room. Not physically, but in scope. A man who had once filled auditoriums now contained by rails on a hospital bed. "You need me," he said, switching tactics. "You know you do. This condition, it requires." "I know what it requires," I said. "I built the protocols you're reading about in journals now. I built the infrastructure that runs your hospital's diagnostics." He flinched at that because even here, even now, the world still ran on my systems, not his. He lifted the paper in a shaking hand. "So why?" he demanded. "Why show me this?" I paused, not for drama, but because the truth deserved a clean delivery. "Because you reached out expecting me to save you," I said. "As if you still had ownership. As if fatherhood were a claim ticket." His lips parted, ready with a rebuttal. I didn't let him. Not with force, just with certainty. "I'm not here to yell," I continued. "I'm not here to punish you with my emotions. I'm here to let you see what the world looks like without you at the center." His eyes narrowed. "And what is that supposed to do?" "It does what the scholarship does," I said. "It makes sure the future can't be hijacked by your name again." He stared at me for a long moment, and in that stare I saw the old reflex returning, entitlement searching for a loophole, for a weakness, for a way to make my choice about him instead of about me. His voice dropped, urgent. "Julianne," he said, softer now, almost pleading. "Whatever you think I did, whatever you think I took, this is my life. I held his gaze. And this is mine, I said. His eyes shimmered with something that might have been fear. Or rage. With him it was hard to tell. So you're going to let me die? He said, and he tried to make it sound like an indictment. I didn't blink. You're not dying because of me, I said. You're here because bodies fail. Because time wins. Because you believed you were exempt. He inhaled sharply, then coughed. An ugly, rattling reminder that his body had already begun its betrayal. I waited for it to pass. Calm. Controlled. No speechifying. When he could breathe again, he whispered, "After everything, you won't help." I rested my hands on my knees, still grounded. "You don't want help," I said quietly. "You want control back." His eyes flared. "That's not." "It is," I said. "Even now you're framing it as something you deserve." His expression shifted. Anger cracking into something else, something rawer. For one fragile second, he looked like a man in a bed instead of a legend on a stage. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice thin. I didn't answer with cruelty. I answered with finality. "I want nothing," I said. "That's the point." He stared at me, and the silence between us filled with the years, the stolen work, the erased name, the blackballing, the collapse, the spectacle. All the things he had done and all the ways the world had protected him until it couldn't. Then I stood. He looked panicked. "Wait," he said, and the word came out too fast. I picked up the folder and tucked it under my arm. "I came to show you my latest achievement," I said. "Not the platform. Not the patents. Not the infrastructure. Those are already everywhere." I nodded toward the paper in his hand. "That is what lasts," I said. "Not because it makes me richer. Because it makes me free." He stared at the scholarship document again, as if the sentence banning his name was burning into his skin. I moved toward the door, then stopped, not to tease, not to perform. Just to place the final truth where it belonged. I turned back to him. "You taught me that the person with the data wins, Dad," I said, voice steady. "You have no data, no legacy, and now no time. I'm not angry. I'm just finished with the experiment." For a moment he looked like he might speak, might finally apologize, might finally admit what he had done. But apology requires humility, and humility had never been his language. His mouth opened, then closed. I waited one beat longer than necessary, long enough to confirm what I already knew. Then I left. The door clicked shut behind me, soft as the end of a sentence. And in the hallway the hospital kept moving. The nurses, the carts, the distant voices, the fluorescent hum. Because the world does not stop for fallen monuments. It only builds around them. If this story hit you in the gut, tap like so YouTube knows you want more justice-driven bedtime threads. Subscribe to @Bedtime Threads AI, and comment "Data wins" if you want the next story in this universe, because the next reckoning is even colder.